My grandson pushed me down the stairs. They laughed and called me dramatic. 2 weeks later, I made them regret it. Subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. This is a story about finding strength when you're at your weakest and reclaiming your power when the people who should love you the most betray you instead. The porcelain vase shattered across my hardwood floor, its delicate blue and white pieces scattering like confetti. 5 generations of Matthew's women had cherished that vase, and now it lay destroyed at the feet of my 10-year-old grandson, Jason. His face twisted in that unsettling half-smile I had grown to dread. "Oops," he said flatly, his eyes challenging me to react. My son Daniel barely even looked up from his phone. "It's just a vase, Mom. Just a vase. Like my grandmother was just an immigrant who carried it across an ocean. Like my mother was just a widow who refused to sell it during the Depression." "Jason needs clearer boundaries," I said during dinner, my voice shakier than I wanted. "This behavior isn't normal." Vanessa, my daughter-in-law, slowly set down her wine glass with exaggerated care. "Not this again, Ellie. Boys will be boys. He's been hurting neighborhood animals," I pressed. "Mrs. Peterson saw him throwing rocks at her cat." "That old bat needs glasses," Vanessa snapped. "And you need to stop criticizing my parenting." Daniel, forever the peacemaker at the expense of truth, forced a weak smile. "Let's just enjoy dinner, okay?" Later that evening, I carried my tea tray upstairs, my arthritis making every step slow and deliberate. My once elegant Victorian home in suburban Boston had turned into a battleground ever since I'd invited Daniel's family to live upstairs after Richard's death 5 years ago. As I reached the top landing, a small figure emerged quietly from the shadows. "Nobody believes you anyway," Jason whispered, his face faintly illuminated by the dim hallway light. Something cold and calculating flickered in eyes far too young to hold that kind of malice. Then I felt it, a sharp, deliberate push against my back. The tea tray flew from my hands as I tumbled backward, my body helpless against gravity. Each edge of the stairs slammed into my flesh as I fell. I heard the crack of bone as my wrist twisted, lightning pain shooting up my arm. "Mom!" Daniel shouted, rushing in from the kitchen. Through tears of agony, I forced the words out. "He pushed me." Jason pushed me on purpose. Daniel and Vanessa exchanged a glance, not one of concern, but of pure exasperation. Vanessa actually rolled her eyes. "Don't be so dramatic, Ellie," she sighed. "Jason says you tripped. Accidents happen at your age." I watched my grandson peeking around the corner, that same half-smile curling on his lips. "I know what happened," I insisted, cradling my shattered wrist. Daniel helped me to my feet with impatient roughness. "Mom, maybe this is a sign we should start thinking about other living arrangements, somewhere with professional care. You've been confused lately, imagining things." As they drove me to the hospital, a cold realization settled deep into my bones, even more painful than my broken wrist. My family wasn't just refusing to believe me, they were actively conspiring against me. In their version of reality, I was simply a confused old woman, an inconvenient obstacle standing between them and what they believed was their inheritance. The cast around my wrist felt like a shackle, a constant reminder of my helplessness. 2 weeks after the accident, as they kept insisting on calling Ita, I shuffled slowly through my bedroom and began noticing small changes. My jewelry box slightly ajar, family photos subtly rearranged. The worn leather journal where I'd been writing my memoirs moved from my desk to the bookshelf. I wasn't losing my mind. They were gaslighting me. "Need anything, Mom?" Daniel asked, hovering in my doorway, his concern nothing more than a thin veneer stretched over impatience. "I'm fine," I murmured, the lie tasting bitter on my tongue. After he left, I noticed the assisted living brochure peeking from beneath yesterday's newspaper, so subtle, so deliberate. That afternoon, I called Beatrice, my oldest friend from the neighborhood. At 75, she had embraced technology with a kind of enthusiasm I'd always found amusing. Now, her knowledge might actually save me. "They think I'm going senile," I whispered into the phone, afraid of being overheard inside my own home. Beatrice arrived the next day carrying what appeared to be harmless decorative items: a vintage clock, a bookend, a small picture frame. Each one, she whispered with unexpected excitement, contained a tiny military-grade camera. "My nephew works in security." That night we placed the cameras carefully around my bedroom and the common areas. My hands trembled not from age, but from the terrible suspicion of what I might soon discover. The next morning, reviewing the footage on the secure tablet Beatrice had set up, I watched Jason slip quietly into my room at dawn. He moved with practiced stealth, heading straight for my jewelry box. His small fingers removed my sapphire earrings, Richard's last Christmas gift to me before cancer took him. But the real shock came hours later. The footage showed Vanessa in the kitchen examining the earrings, nodding with satisfaction before slipping them into her pocket. "Good eyes, sweetie," she told Jason, ruffling his hair. "These are worth at least $1,000. My breath caught painfully in my chest. Over the next week, the cameras exposed an orchestrated campaign. Jason regularly invaded my space, stealing items both valuable and sentimental. Daniel accidentally spilled coffee all over my manuscript, 40 years of research on women poets of the Victorian era. Vanessa moved my medications and then calmly insisted I must have misplaced them when I couldn't find them. The final straw came during Sunday brunch with their friends. Jason brought his classroom's pet hamster home for the weekend, and in my bathroom the camera captured something I will never forget. He stood there holding the terrified little creature underwater, his expression not cruel but strangely curious, as if death itself were merely an interesting experiment. When the poor animal finally stopped moving, Vanessa calmly helped him dispose of the evidence. "We'll tell Mrs. Evans it escaped," she said with unsettling composure. These things happen. That night, through my slightly open door, I overheard them talking. "The house would sell for at least $1.2 million in this market," Vanessa whispered. "Plus, whatever's left of her savings and investments," Daniel added. "And Jason's college fund, almost $350,000 now. She's not going to need any of it in a nursing home," Vanessa replied. I closed my eyes then, and a strange calm slowly replaced the fear that had been living inside me for weeks. In that quiet moment, Eleanor Matthews' widow, Professor Emerita, grandmother died, and someone new, someone with absolutely nothing left to lose, was born in her place. "The pain still bothers you?" Dr. Sheldon asked during my appointment, gently examining my healing wrist. "The physical pain is manageable," I replied carefully, though something in my voice made her pause. She seemed young for an orthopedist, perhaps 40, with sharp, observant eyes that appeared to miss nothing. "Mrs. Matthews," she said slowly, "is everything all right at home?" For a brief moment I considered telling her everything, every ugly detail. But what could she really do? Call Adult Protective Services. Without proof, it would still be my word against theirs, a contest I had already lost once. "I'm fine," I said automatically. As I gathered my purse to leave, Dr. Sheldon slipped a business card into my hand. "This is Carolyn Winters. She's a social worker who specializes in elder rights." "I don't need," I began. "Just take it," she interrupted gently. "Sometimes talking helps." I slipped the card into my pocket, where it seemed to burn like a hot coal against my skin. 3 days later, after Vanessa had helpfully suggested I sign power of attorney over to Daniel, I found myself sitting inside Caroline's office, a warm, peaceful space filled with leafy plants and comfortable chairs. "Elder abuse takes many forms," Caroline explained in a calm, matter-of-fact voice. "Financial exploitation is actually more common than physical abuse." "I'm not being abused," I protested weakly. Caroline's smile was kind, but it carried a quiet certainty. "Then why are you here, Eleanor?" That simple question broke something open inside me, and suddenly the story poured out of me in a flood. Jason's cruelty, Vanessa's manipulations, Daniel's betrayal, the hidden cameras, and the college fund they were already counting as theirs. "I've lost everything," I finished at last. "My dignity, my family, my home." "Not yet, you haven't," a voice said gently from the doorway. I turned to see a tall, silver-haired woman standing there, her posture impeccable, radiating the kind of quiet confidence I remembered once possessing myself. "Eleanor, this is Martha Sullivan," Caroline said as she introduced us. "She leads our support group." Martha sat down beside me and took my trembling hands in her steady ones. "2 years ago," she said calmly, "my son and his wife tried to commit me to a memory care facility for the crime of refusing to sell my beach house to fund their failing business." "What did you do?" I asked quietly. Martha's smile was fierce and unwavering. "I reminded them that age isn't a disease," she said, "and being underestimated is only a temporary condition." That same afternoon, I attended my first support group meeting, and the stories I heard there stunned me. Educated, accomplished men and women who were being systematically stripped of their independence and dignity by the very people who were supposed to protect them. Through Martha, I was introduced to George Harrington, a silver-haired attorney who specialized in elder law. "Your case is unfortunately common," George told me during our consultation, but it contains some uncommon elements that actually work in our favor, especially the college fund. Tell me about its origins. I explained that James, my first husband and Daniel's father, had established the fund before his sudden death when Daniel was only 14, and that Richard, my second husband, had continued contributing to it faithfully for years. Now it held nearly $350,000, with me as the sole trustee. George leaned forward slightly. Here's what they don't know, Eleanor, he said. That money is legally designated for educational purposes, yes, but as trustee, you have considerable latitude in how those purposes are defined. For the first time in weeks, I felt a faint flicker of something other than fear, not quite hope, but perhaps its more dangerous cousin, possibility. They think you're deteriorating mentally, George continued, jotting notes in his leather-bound portfolio. That's what they're telling everyone, I confirmed, sliding the assisted living brochures across his desk. Vanessa leaves these everywhere and then gaslights me when I mention them. We sat in George's oak-paneled office, surrounded by towering shelves of law books and the quiet authority of generations of legal practice. With Martha's encouragement, I had expanded my documentation, a journal, carefully recording daily incidents, video evidence meticulously backed up onto external drives, and photographs of the items Jason had stolen from me. Perfect, George said with a nod. Now we moved to phase 2, strategic compliance. The strategy was elegant in its simplicity. I would appear to decline exactly the way they expected me to. I would become just a little more forgetful, slightly more dependent, occasionally confused about dates or names, give them the false confidence they need to make mistakes. Martha had advised me during one of our now irregular coffee meetings, people reveal themselves when they believe they're winning, and with that truth firmly in mind, I implemented the plan immediately. At breakfast I pretended to forget what day it was, frowning at the calendar, as though it had betrayed me, and when Vanessa mentioned an upcoming school event for Jason, I allowed confusion to cross my face, appearing momentarily bewildered. Later that night I overheard Daniel speaking quietly to Vanessa. Mom's getting worse, he said. Maybe we should accelerate our timeline. Their timeline. My opening. The next morning I went to the bank and met with Thomas Bradley, my financial advisor of 20 years. Someone's been attempting to access your accounts, Eleanor, he told me gravely, using your social security number and claiming to have power of attorney. My son, I said quietly, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. Thomas's expression hardened immediately. We denied access, of course. Under George's careful guidance, I began restructuring my assets, nothing dramatic enough to raise suspicion. Just small adjustments designed to secure what was still mine. Meanwhile, back at home, I leaned deeper into the role I had chosen to play. When Vanessa suggested I sign some routine paperwork, I simply smiled vaguely and promised to look at it later. When Daniel brought up the idea of selling some of my antiques to simplify my life, I pretended to consider it thoughtfully. You're making it too easy, Mom, Daniel said suspiciously after one such conversation. I'm just tired of fighting, I replied softly, letting defeat seep into my voice. You know what's best. A flicker of guilt crossed his face for a brief moment before hardening again into quiet resolution. The moral calculation of a man determined to justify his own betrayal. That night Jason took things to a new and darker level. When I reached for my heart medication, I discovered the bottle was empty. Looking for these, he said from my doorway, dangling the pills in his small hand. Old people take too many drugs. That's what Mom says. Jason, please, I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. I need those. Say please again, he said with excitement shining in his eyes. Like you're begging. In that instant everything crystallized with brutal clarity. This was no longer just about money or property. They were systematically destroying me, my grandson, through deliberate cruelty, my daughter-in-law through cold, calculated manipulation, and my son through the most devastating weapon of all, indifference. Later, alone in my bedroom, I studied an old photograph from my teaching days. In it, a confident woman with straight posture and steady eyes stood before a lecture hall, commanding respect without ever demanding it. Taking a slow breath, I picked up the phone and called the number Martha had given me for emergencies. It's time, I said quietly. They've escalated. We're ready, Martha replied. The question is, are you? The next morning, Jason delivered his cruelty as casually as someone asking for more orange juice. Grandma, when are you going to die? He asked over breakfast, the question falling into the room with chilling normalcy and silencing the kitchen. I carefully set down my teacup, noticing that even Daniel looked briefly uncomfortable. Jason, he scolded weakly, that's not appropriate. Vanessa simply smirked while buttering her toast. He's just curious. Daniel, children are naturally inquisitive about life cycles. I turned to my grandson with a gentle smile, remembering the strategic compliance Martha and George had coached me to maintain. I don't know, sweetheart. Why do you ask? Dad says we can't convert this place into a gaming room until you're gone, Jason said matter-of. It's taking forever. The mask slipped from Daniel's face, shock first, then anger at being exposed before he forced an awkward laugh. Kids, he said, they misunderstand everything. But he didn't deny it. That afternoon, I quietly implemented the next phase of our plan. With Beatrice's help, I had already spent the past week secretly removing my most precious possessions, family photographs, my journals, and the jewelry that remained after Jason's theft, and storing them safely at Martha's home. Now, it was time for the catalyst. While the family was out, I carefully planted a fabricated bank statement on my desk, showing a large withdrawal to an unnamed account, then left the house for what I told them was a therapy appointment. In reality, it was a meeting with George and his financial team. Everything's in place, George confirmed, sliding several documents across his desk. The Second Chances Foundation is officially established as a restricted educational fund. All we need is your signature. I stared at the papers that would permanently transfer Jason's entire college fund, $350,000, into a charitable foundation dedicated to supporting victims of bullying and seniors pursuing continuing education. This isn't legally reversible, I asked. Completely irrevocable, George assured me. My hand trembled slightly as I signed, not from doubt, but from the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about money. It was my declaration of independence. When I returned home later that evening, the fabricated bank statement was gone from my desk exactly as I had predicted. That night I lay quietly in bed, listening to Vanessa and Daniel arguing in their bedroom. How could she withdraw that much without us knowing? Vanessa hissed angrily. I don't know, Daniel snapped. The bank won't tell me anything. They keep saying I don't have authorization. You're her son. What about the dementia angle? Can't we use that? I tried. They want formal documentation, medical evaluations. Then get them, Vanessa whispered sharply. That money is for Jason's future, our future. I lay there in the darkness listening to them plot against me, feeling a strange calm settle over my thoughts. They had shown me exactly who they were. Now it was time to show them who I had become. The following morning at breakfast, Vanessa could barely contain herself. Ellie, she began with carefully manufactured concern. Daniel noticed some unusual activity in your accounts, large withdrawals, and he said they were worried someone might be taking advantage of me. I blinked slowly, wearing the perfect picture of elderly confusion. Withdrawals? I don't remember making any withdrawals. Exactly, our concern. Daniel jumped in quickly, relief evident in his voice. Maybe I should start handling your finances for safety. I frowned as if struggling to understand, but I did move some money recently. That education fund for Jason's college. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet. Vanessa set down her coffee cup with a sharp clink. What about Jason's college fund? Her voice had suddenly lost every trace of concern. I donated it, I said simply, to a wonderful educational foundation. They help bullying victims and seniors continuing their education. Isn't that lovely? With the fund irrevocably transferred to the Second Chances Foundation, I began implementing the next phase of my plan. I subtly started removing the remaining personal items from the house, documents and mementos that had somehow remained untouched by Jason's theft, and stored them safely at Martha's. During this process, I discovered something disturbing hidden in the porcelain cabinet. Letters Daniel had written to Richard years ago, complaining that I was controlling and had never supported him. A complete distortion of reality. I had sacrificed everything for him after his father died, working 2 jobs just to put him through college. Even more disturbing were medical records revealing that Jason had been diagnosed with conduct disorder, a serious condition marked by persistent antisocial behavior. The reports clearly showed doctors had recommended intensive therapy, yet Vanessa had refused treatment, considering it an unnecessary stigma. Meanwhile, the surveillance footage continued to capture evidence of Jason's behavior, including one incident where he deliberately smashed several family photographs while Vanessa merely sighed and muttered, "Kids will be kids." Before quietly hiding the damage, I continued my performance of cognitive decline, forgetting names, appearing confused about dates, playing the role perfectly. The strategy worked exactly as intended. Daniel and Vanessa gradually relaxed their vigilance, convinced I was no longer a threat to their plans. During this time, I met secretly with Caroline, who carefully documented signs of neglect and emotional abuse, and together we compiled a detailed dossier of the treatment I had been receiving. What if I'm wrong? I confessed to Caroline during one of those meetings. What if they really care about me in their own way? Caroline gently reviewed the evidence we had gathered and replied softly, "Love is shown through actions, not empty words. You deserve dignity, Ellie." Strengthened by that support, I began reconnecting with former colleagues from my teaching days. Many were shocked by my situation, having been told by Daniel that I had become reclusive by choice. Professor Walter Collins, now directing a creative writing program, was particularly outraged and immediately offered his help. As I continued developing plans with my growing support network, Vanessa began pushing more aggressively for me to sign property transfer documents. When I calmly asked to consult an attorney first, she exploded in anger. "Why do you need to complicate things? Don't you trust your own son after everything we've done for you?" The outburst happened in Caroline's presence, whom Vanessa still believed was simply my elderly friend. With a witness present, I finally responded calmly, "Trust is a two-way street, dear, and I believe that road has been closed for some time." The stunned look on Vanessa's face confirmed it was time to execute the final phase of my plan. 2 months after the stair incident, I deliberately left a modified bank statement on my desk suggesting I had transferred a substantial sum into a personal account. As expected, Vanessa found it while tidying my room. That night, I overheard Vanessa and Daniel arguing fiercely about the money. Vanessa insisted Daniel confront me immediately, while he worried it might complicate their plans to move me into a nursing home. The next morning at breakfast, Daniel approached the subject casually. "Mom, I noticed you made some transactions recently. Are you sure you don't want me to help manage your finances?" I looked at him with practiced confusion. "What transactions? What, dear? I don't remember making any." Over the following days, I watched their agitation grow as they made frantic phone calls, clearly trying to trace the money. Their behavior confirmed exactly what I had suspected all along. They had been monitoring my accounts without permission. Finally, during a tense dinner, Vanessa could no longer contain herself. "Ellie, what happened to Jason's college fund? The bank says you emptied it completely." I looked at both of them with innocent confusion. "Oh, that fund. Yes, I transferred it. I was worried something might happen to me, like falling downstairs, and I wanted to make sure the money would be used properly." The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel paled visibly while Vanessa's face twisted with barely restrained fury. "What do you mean transferred? That money was for Jason's education," she practically shouted. "And it still is for education," I replied calmly, "just not exclusively his. The Second Chances Foundation will help many deserving students, especially bullying victims and seniors continuing their education." Their reactions were immediate and revealing. Vanessa erupted into accusations. Daniel swung between anger and desperate manipulation, and Jason, caught in the middle of it all, finally revealed his true nature. "You ruined everything, you stupid old woman," he screamed. "It was my money." I simply stood there, looked at each of them in turn, and said softly, "No, it wasn't your money. It was a conditional gift, an opportunity you lost through your own actions. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a bag to pack." Leaving them standing there in stunned silence, I returned to my room where a small suitcase was already waiting. Carefully prepared, the first phase of my plan was complete, and the next morning I was gone. My room remained intact, except for a few personal items and a simple note that read, "Need time to think. Don't try to contact me." At first, Daniel and Vanessa weren't concerned at all, convinced I would return soon, apologetic and vulnerable, and they even treated my disappearance like some dramatic episode that might actually help accelerate their plans to sell the house. But when days slowly stretched into a week, worry finally began to creep in. Not for me, of course, but for what my absence meant for their carefully constructed financial plans. Daniel tried accessing my bank accounts, only to discover the passwords had been changed and a note had been added, flagging any unauthorized access. Attempts for immediate reporting to the authorities. Meanwhile, I was comfortably settled in a quiet apartment arranged by Martha just a few towns away. From there, I kept track of everything through trusted neighbors and the surveillance system Beatrice had helped maintain. The cameras captured scenes that were both revealing and deeply telling. Vanessa and Daniel frantically searching through my office for financial documents, Jason inviting friends over for destructive parties, and a steady stream of real estate agents coming and going, even though no sale could legally move forward without my signature. 2 weeks after my departure, I initiated the next phase of the plan. George sent a formal letter notifying Daniel and Vanessa that they were violating the terms of our verbal housing agreement and had 60 days to vacate the property. The letter also mentioned that substantial evidence of elder abuse and attempted financial fraud existed and would be presented to the authorities if they failed to comply. Their reaction was pure chaos. The cameras captured Vanessa flying into a rage, smashing objects and screaming accusations, while Daniel looked increasingly defeated, finally beginning to grasp the severity of their situation. Gradually, my story began circulating throughout the community. Former colleagues from the literature department, led by Professor Collins, discreetly shared my situation within influential social circles, and neighbors who had quietly witnessed years of disrespectful behavior from my family began openly expressing their outrage, feeling isolated and desperate. Daniel eventually reported me as a potentially confused missing elderly person, clearly hoping the authorities would locate me and return me to the care of my so-called loving family. But the plan backfired spectacularly when Detective Sarah Jenkins received an envelope personally delivered by George. Inside were surveillance recordings documenting the abuse I had endured, including the stair incident, along with complete financial and medical documentation proving my competence and exposing their attempts at manipulation. After conducting a careful investigation, Detective Jenkins eventually located me, not to force me home, but simply to confirm that I was safe and to offer additional assistance if I needed it. 3 weeks after my disappearance, I sent out 3 very important letters at the same time, one to Daniel and Vanessa, another to Jason's school, and a third to Daniel's company. The letter to my family was a formal legal ultimatum prepared by George that clearly outlined their options: voluntarily vacate my home within the specified time frame, or face formal eviction proceedings that could potentially include criminal charges for elder abuse and attempted fraud. The letter to Jason's school contained selected documentation of his troubling behavior, along with proof that his parents had repeatedly refused psychological treatment, and I requested a professional evaluation for the safety and well-being of both Jason and his classmates, including evidence of the hamster incident and several other disturbing behaviors. The third letter, sent to the ethics department of Daniel's company, discreetly raised concerns about his use of my personal intellectual property, academic work he had apparently incorporated into a recent marketing campaign without attribution. The consequences were swift and devastating. Within just a few days, Daniel found himself facing a disciplinary meeting at work. Jason's school mandated a full psychological evaluation as a condition for his continued enrollment, and George officially initiated legal proceedings to reclaim my property. Vanessa, finally beginning to understand how serious their situation had become, decided to attempt a completely different strategy. Through mutual contacts, she arranged a meeting and presented herself as a supposed peacemaker. During a tense lunch at a public restaurant, she shifted between emotional pleas and subtle threats. "Destroying our family won't bring you the dignity you're seeking," she argued. "Think about how this will affect your reputation when people learn you abandoned your own grandson." I remained calm, composed, and completely unmoved. "My dear, I didn't destroy anything. I simply stopped rebuilding what you continuously demolished. And as for my reputation, perhaps you should consider your own." At the end of our meeting, Vanessa made one final desperate attempt, offering to return everything Jason had stolen and promising they would finally get him the help he needed, if I would only withdraw the eviction demands and possible charges. For a brief moment I considered it, genuinely worried about Jason's welfare despite everything that had happened. But in the end, I simply said, "The problem, Vanessa, is that promises require trust, and some vases, once broken, simply can't be glued back together." Meanwhile, Daniel, now facing serious professional consequences and finally beginning to comprehend the gravity of what he had done, attempted a more sincere approach. In a long letter, he partially admitted his mistakes, though he still blamed much of it on stress and Vanessa's influence. My response was brief but carried all the weight it needed to. "Growing up isn't optional, Daniel. It's necessary, and it usually happens when we face the consequences of our choices, not when we avoid them." As the eviction deadlines slowly approached, The fragile structure of what remained of our family finally collapsed completely, with Daniel and Vanessa turning on each other in explosive arguments that neighbors could easily hear through the walls, their blame and resentment spilling out into the open, while Jason, sensing the growing tension and increasingly left without supervision, escalated his destructive behavior until it culminated in a serious school incident that resulted in his temporary suspension. Watching all of this from the safe distance provided by Martha and the quiet strength of my growing support network, I found myself facing a deeply personal moral crisis of my own, wondering how far my pursuit of justice had drifted towards something that looked uncomfortably like revenge, and what emotional cost this battle was extracting from everyone involved, including myself. 3 months later, after extensive legal proceedings, multiple hearings, and several unsuccessful attempts by Daniel and Vanessa to contest the ruling, the eviction was finally carried out. They were forced to leave my house and relocate to a much smaller apartment across town, and the public humiliation that followed was intense, especially for Vanessa, whose real estate business began to suffer once the story quietly circulated through the same elite social circles where she had built her reputation. Daniel, now facing probation at work and watching his marriage slowly unravel, eventually sought therapy, where he began confronting toxic patterns that stretched back to his childhood, not because of my supposed failings as he had believed for so many years, but because of his own inability to establish healthy boundaries and take responsibility for his choices. Meanwhile, Jason's mandatory psychological evaluation confirmed what had long been suspected. He was suffering from advanced conduct disorder, requiring immediate and consistent intervention. Vanessa, reluctantly and under pressure, finally agreed to enroll him in intensive therapy, though she continued publicly blaming me for the trauma she claimed I had inflicted on the family. When I finally reclaimed my house and walked through its quiet, empty rooms, I found myself overwhelmed by conflicting emotions, because although the victory had restored my autonomy and dignity, it also felt strangely hollow, the price being the painful and possibly permanent loss of my relationship with my son and grandson. Troubled by the direction my life had taken, I sought guidance from Caroline, who had gradually become not only an ally but a trusted friend. "You didn't destroy your family, Ellie," she reassured me gently. "You simply stopped allowing them to destroy you." There's a crucial difference. During this period of reflection, I received an unexpected letter from Jason, written under the supervision of his therapist. The words carried a hesitant apology for the stair incident and for the items he had stolen. It was far from a complete reconciliation, but it represented the first fragile sign that perhaps something meaningful could grow from the ashes of what had been broken. Along with the letter came several of the stolen items he returned, including a pearl necklace that had belonged to my mother. A quiet but powerful reminder that not everything in life is permanently destroyed. Encouraged by this small but meaningful step, I began pouring my energy into the Second Chances Foundation. Working alongside Professor Collins and several of my former colleagues, I helped design programs specifically aimed at supporting children struggling with severe behavioral problems as well as elderly individuals facing abuse within their own families. My own experience, carefully anonymized, eventually became a case study in an ethics course at the local university. And when I was invited to speak to the class as an expert consultant, I unexpectedly discovered a new calling in educating young professionals about the warning signs of elder abuse and the importance of protecting lifelong autonomy. During one such lecture, I noticed a familiar figure standing quietly at the back of the hall. It was Daniel, observing, in silence. He didn't approach me afterward, and I didn't publicly acknowledge his presence. But the simple fact that he had come suggested that perhaps he was finally beginning to understand. Around that same time, Martha's health suddenly deteriorated, and she was admitted to the hospital with a serious prognosis. I spent time at her bedside every day, determined to return even a fraction of the unwavering support she had offered me during my darkest hours. Sitting beside her in the hospital, surrounded by the fragile reminders of life's uncertainty, I began reflecting on what forgiveness truly meant, not as a gift for those who had hurt me, but as a form of release for myself. 6 months after the eviction, my life had settled into a completely new rhythm. My home, once the center of emotional conflict, had been renovated and transformed into a warm, welcoming space that finally reflected my own tastes and needs. One bedroom became a writing studio where I returned to the manuscript Jason had once ruined. The Second Chances Foundation was flourishing, and we had already awarded our first 10 scholarships. I discovered deep fulfillment in helping both traumatized young people and older adults searching for a second beginning, to groups whose struggles I now understood on a deeply personal level. Distinguished service to the community. The citation read as Mayor Thompson presented me with the Maxwell Foundation Community Leadership Award for creating educational opportunities for vulnerable populations through the Second Chances Foundation. Camera flashes lit the room as I accepted the crystal trophy. My first public recognition since the foundation had been established 9 months earlier. The irony was impossible to ignore. Having once been dismissed as a confused old woman, only to now stand receiving accolades before Boston's educational elite. Sitting in the audience was the family I had chosen rather than the one I had been born into. Martha, elegant in midnight blue, Caroline smiling proudly, George and his wife nodding in approval, Beatrice quietly wiping tears, and Professor Collins giving me an enthusiastic thumbs up. Thank you, I began in my acceptance speech, my voice steady. Second chances aren't just about new opportunities, they're about reclaiming your own narrative when others have tried to write your ending for you. As I spoke about elder empowerment and access to education, I noticed movement near the back of the hall. Daniel had slipped in and was standing awkwardly against the wall. Our eyes met briefly before I continued speaking. Later, after the ceremony, while I was surrounded by congratulations and requests for photographs, he approached me hesitantly. That was a wonderful speech, Mom. Thank you for coming, I replied, surprised but calm. How's Jason? Daniel's expression darkened slightly, struggling. The intensive therapy program is helping, but the doctors say his condition is complicated. Years of enabling made everything worse. How are you managing with work? I asked, genuinely concerned despite everything that had happened. Better, he said. The ethics investigation was settled. I have to complete corporate responsibility training, but I kept my job. He paused awkwardly before continuing. Mom, I've been thinking about what you said about trust being hard to rebuild. I'd like to try if you're willing. Before I could respond, Martha suddenly appeared beside me, as protective as ever. Eleanor, the foundation donors are waiting to meet you. This is my son Daniel, I said as I introduced them. Daniel, this is Martha Sullivan, my closest friend. Martha's assessment of him was swift and completely uncompromising. So, you're the son who didn't believe his mother was pushed down the stairs. Daniel flushed at the accusation, but he held her gaze without looking away. Yes, he said quietly. I'm trying to make amends for that, and many other failures. After Martha eventually walked away, Daniel released a long, tense breath. Your friends are formidable, he admitted. They protected me when I needed it most, I replied simply. Then Daniel shared something I hadn't expected. I filed for divorce from Vanessa. It was finalized last month. I'm sorry, I said automatically. Don't be, he answered quickly. It was long overdue. After everything came to light, I realized how much I had surrendered my own judgment to hers, how I betrayed you just to keep the peace with her. And Jason? I asked quietly. How is the custody arrangement? I have primary custody now. Her career has always come first. She sees him every other weekend, when it's convenient for her schedule. The bitterness in his voice revealed wounds deeper than I had previously understood, and for the first time, I wondered if perhaps, like me, he too had been manipulated in ways I had never fully seen. The foundation referred us to Dr. Winters at Boston Children's. Daniel continued. She specializes in Jason's diagnosis. For the first time, I feel like we're actually getting real help instead of excuses. I'm glad. I told him sincerely. Would you consider meeting with him in a therapeutic setting, with his doctor present? Daniel asked carefully, his voice tentative as though he fully expected rejection. Dr. Winters believes it might be important for his progress if he can make amends, even if it's in a structured environment. I hesitated, conflicting emotions pulling at me from opposite directions. The grandmother who still loved a troubled child struggling against the woman who had once been deliberately pushed down a staircase. I'll consider it, I finally said. Have Dr. Winters contact me directly. As Daniel prepared to leave, he paused and turned back, something unexpectedly vulnerable in his expression. I'm proud of what you've created, Mom. The foundation, your advocacy work. Dad would have been proud too, both of them. Hearing the names of James and Richard, the two men I had loved and lost, stirred something deep inside me. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but perhaps something related to it. a distant cousin called possibility. Days later, rain tapped softly against the windows of Dr. Winter's office while I sat waiting, my hands clasped tightly together in an attempt to hide their trembling. 3 months of careful preparation had led to this moment. My first supervised meeting with Jason since the confrontation. Dr. Rebecca Winters, a calm woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a firm, no-nonsense presence, had carefully prepared me for what I might encounter. Jason has made progress, she had explained during our preliminary consultation, but his journey is only beginning. He started developing empathy, though for now it remains intellectual rather than intuitive. The door finally opened and Daniel stepped inside first, offering an encouraging nod to someone standing behind him. Then Jason entered the room. He looked taller than I remembered, his face thinner, his eyes carrying a strange wariness. At nearly 11 years old, he stood on the fragile edge of adolescence, that dangerous stage where childhood cruelty could either be redirected into growth or hardened permanently into something darker. "Hello, grandmother," he said formally, using the title Dr. Winters had recommended instead of the familiar grandma. "Hello, Jason," I replied, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. Dr. Winters guided us through the interaction carefully, keeping everything structured and controlled. There would be no physical contact, no unscripted exchanges, and no discussion of the inheritance or family conflicts. Only carefully managed communication centered on accountability and boundaries. "Jason has prepared something he would like to share," Dr. Winters said after the initial greetings. Jason reached into his pocket and slowly removed a folded sheet of paper, opening it with deliberate care. "I have written an accountability statement," he explained in a flat, mechanical tone, "about the stairs." My chest tightened as he began reading aloud. "I, Jason Matthews, acknowledge that I deliberately pushed my grandmother down the stairs on February 12th. I did this because I was angry that she suggested I needed boundaries. I knew it would hurt her physically. I lied about it afterward because I didn't want to get in trouble. When she was hurt worse than I expected, I was scared, but I also didn't care much about her pain." He continued reading with the same unsettling calmness, acknowledging how he had stolen my belongings, destroyed my manuscript, tormented animals, and taken pleasure in causing distress. The clinical precision of his confession felt strangely more chilling than any emotional outburst might have been. "My actions show a pattern of harmful behavior," he concluded. "I am working with Dr. Winters to understand why I do these things and to develop healthier responses." When he finished, he folded the paper carefully and placed it on the coffee table between us. Then watched my reaction with analytical curiosity rather than genuine remorse. "Thank you for your honesty, Jason," I said, repeating the response Dr. Winters had coached me to give. The session continued exactly according to plan, with structured exchanges, therapeutic guidance when necessary, and strict maintenance of boundaries throughout. Jason's responses remained calculated, his participation feeling more like performance than emotional engagement, yet occasionally there were brief flickers of something more hopeful. Tiny moments when the rehearsed script slipped away and the real child, underneath, peeked through his carefully constructed facade. As our session neared its end, Dr. Winters asked if I had any final thoughts to share. "I want you to understand something important, Jason," I said, meeting his eyes directly. "What happened between us does not define who you can become. You are still young, and many paths remain open before you. The choices you make from this point forward will matter far more than the mistakes behind you." For the first time, an unscripted expression crossed his face, perhaps confusion, or maybe the first faint realization that the woman sitting across from him was no longer the powerless figure he once believed her to be. "But you're still not giving back the college money," he said flatly. Daniel stiffened beside him, but Dr. Winters raised a hand gently, allowing me the space to respond. "The foundation money is helping many students, including some with challenges similar to yours," I explained calmly. "If you continue your therapeutic work and maintain academic progress, you could apply for a scholarship yourself when the time comes." His eyes narrowed slightly as he processed the new information, calculating what it meant. "So, I could still get money for college. You could earn a scholarship." "Yes, based on merit and need like anyone else." The distinction was not lost on him. For perhaps the first time in his life, Jason was confronting the idea of earning something rather than simply taking it or expecting it to be handed to him. After the session, Dr. Winters offered her professional assessment. "This was productive," she noted thoughtfully. "Jason's conduct disorder presents significant challenges, but I'm seeing incremental progress." His accountability statement, while emotionally detached, represents cognitive advancement in understanding causality and responsibility. Will he ever develop genuine empathy? I asked quietly, voicing the question that had haunted me since the moment I discovered the full extent of his cruelty. Dr. Winters chose her words with care. In severe cases like Jason's, emotional empathy often remains limited, but cognitive empathy, understanding others' perspectives intellectually, can be developed. With consistent therapy and appropriate boundaries, many patients learn to function ethically even without the emotional component most people take for granted. Are you nervous? Martha asked later, adjusting the collar of my navy blue blazer as we stood together in the university auditorium lobby. 18 months had passed since that fateful fall down the stairs, 18 months of rebuilding, reclaiming, and reinventing my life. A little, I admitted honestly. It's been decades since I lectured. Today marked my return to academia, not as the timid adjunct I had become after marrying Richard, but as a visiting professor teaching a seminar on elder advocacy and autonomy to graduate social work students. Caroline had arranged the opportunity, convinced that my first-hand experience could offer insights no textbook ever could. You'll be magnificent, Martha assured me, squeezing my hand before taking her seat among the audience. As I approached the podium and looked out over the eager faces of 36 graduate students, I felt an unexpected calm settle inside me. This was no longer the frightened woman who had once been pushed down a staircase. This was Professor Eleanor Matthews, survivor, advocate, and teacher once again. Dignity isn't automatically diminished by age, I began, my voice strong and steady, yet our society often equates gray hair with declining competence, creating vulnerabilities that can be exploited, sometimes by the very people entrusted with our care. For the next hour, I shared both research and personal insight about recognizing the signs of elder abuse, establishing healthy boundaries, and maintaining autonomy as we age. The students' engagement was immediate and intense, their questions thoughtful and probing. When the session concluded with enthusiastic applause, I noticed a familiar figure seated quietly in the back row. Daniel, who had spent the past year attending therapy himself, working to understand the patterns that had led him to enable both Vanessa's manipulation and Jason's troubling behavior. That was incredible, Mom, he said once the room began to empty. The way you transformed something painful into education for others, it's inspiring. Thank you for coming, I replied, genuinely touched by his presence. Our relationship was still a work in progress, cautious and carefully bounded by respect rather than blind trust, but slowly healing through consistent effort from both of us. How is Jason doing at the new school? I asked as we walked together toward the reception area. Better, the structured environment helps. His therapist says he's showing real progress in impulse control. Daniel paused, then added with careful honesty, he still struggles with emotional empathy, but he's learning to consider consequences before acting. They call it progress by proxy, doing the right thing, even if the reasons aren't the conventional ones. I nodded, accepting the realism of that assessment. Jason's journey would likely be lifelong and complex, but at least the necessary intervention had finally happened. Later that afternoon, I met with the board of the Second Chances Foundation to review our expanding programs. What had begun as Jason's redirected college fund had now grown into something far greater, including corporate partnerships, matching grants, and a permanent endowment designed to ensure the foundation's work would continue long after I was gone. The therapeutic education program has shown remarkable success, Professor Collins reported proudly. 12 students are receiving specialized support this semester alone. One of those students was Jason. Though, aside from Collins, none of the board members knew about the personal connection. His application had been evaluated independently, his scholarship awarded based on documented need and therapeutic progress, rather than family ties or obligation. That evening, Martha hosted a small dinner party to celebrate both my successful lecture and the foundation's latest accomplishments. My chosen family gathered warmly around her dining table. Caroline, Beatrice, George and his wife, Professor Collins, and several new friends I had met through my advocacy work. To Eleanor, Martha said with a smile, raising her glass in a toast, who reminds us that our third act can be our most powerful. As conversation flowed around the table, I found myself quietly reflecting on the long journey of the past 18 months. The path from victim to victory had never been straight or simple. I still carried scars, both physical and emotional, and trust had become something carefully guarded, given only conditionally rather than freely. Yet the woman who had emerged from that crucible was stronger than the one who had fallen, more discerning in relationships, more confident in boundaries, and more purposeful in her actions. Later that night, alone in my home, now truly mine again in every sense, I stood at my bedroom window and gazed out at the garden I had replanted after they left. Spring bulbs were beginning to emerge, their tender shoots pushing determinedly through the still cold soil, reaching toward sunlight and possibility. At 75, I had finally learned what had eluded me my entire life, that validation comes not from others' approval, but from honoring your own truth, that family can be chosen rather than merely inherited, that boundaries aren't selfish, but essential, and that sometimes the greatest act of love is simply saying, no more. Eleanor Matthews, I whispered softly to my reflection, you are exactly where you're supposed to be. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, that statement felt completely, unquestionably true. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe, and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.